They say water has a memory. And if that's true, the creek running through the back of my timberland remembers exactly what a $2,000 suit looks like when it's covered in 3 inches of Missouri silt. My name is Silas Thorne, and I'm a man who spent 24 years in the Army Corps of Engineers learning 2 very important things. First, you never fight the terrain, and second, never underestimate a woman with a clipboard and a god complex who thinks she can outrun a flash flood. It all started when the rolling hills of my family's 120-acre ranch, a place my great-grandfather carved out of the wilderness with nothing but a mule and a stubborn streak a mile wide, got surrounded by a sea of beige siding and manicured lawns known as, the Heights at Willow Creek, I was the holdout, the stubborn ghost in the machine, living in a farmhouse that smelled like cedar and wood smoke, while my neighbors lived in houses that all looked like they were printed on the same 3D printer in a factory in Ohio. The centerpiece of my property, and the bane of the local homeowners association, was the old Sentinel, a hand-stacked limestone dam my gramps built in 1948 to keep the spring runoff from turning our lower pasture into a swamp, and for 70-odd years, that dam did its job with quiet, rock-solid dignity, until Beatrice Vane moved in and decided that my family's history was a liability to the community's aesthetic vision, Beatrice was the kind of person who didn't and oppose. Just walk into a room, she colonized it, usually while wearing yoga pants that cost more than my first truck and carrying a latte like it was a scepter of office. She'd been the HOA president for 3 years, and in her mind, the fact that my land was and oppose. Part of her jurisdiction was just a minor clerical error she intended to fix with enough legal paperwork to bury a small village. I remember the first time she stepped onto my porch, her heels clicking on the floorboards like a death knell, looking at my mud-covered boots with a level of disgust usually reserved for active crime scenes. She told me, without a hint of irony, that my, primitive water feature, was creating a breeding ground for mosquitoes and devaluing the, visual harmony, of the neighboring infinity pools, and when I told her that the dam was there before her house was a blueprint, she just smiled. That cold, shark-like smile that tells you someone is already calculating the cost of your funeral. She started small, sending anonymous, wellness checks, to see if I was hoarding animals or if my septic tank was up to code, but when I passed every inspection with flying colors, she pivoted to the, infrastructure sustainability fee, a $15,000 bill for, downstream environmental mitigation, that she claimed I owed because my dam was allegedly altering the natural flow of the creek they'd spent millions, beautifying, I'm a patient man by nature. You have to be when you're waiting for concrete to cure or for a bridge to settle. But Beatrice pushed a button I didn't know I had when she started targeting my daughter, Clara. Clara was planning her wedding on the ranch, right down by the creek under the big willow tree, and 3 weeks before the big day, Beatrice filed an emergency injunction claiming the area was a drowning hazard, because of the dam's structural integrity. I spent 10 days in court fighting that woman, watching her lie through her perfectly whitened teeth about, cracks, and, seepage, that didn't and oppose, exist, and while I eventually got the injunction tossed, the look in her eyes told me she was and oppose, done playing God. The day of the wedding was supposed to be perfect. The air was crisp, the smell of wild mint was thick near the water, and I was in my dress blues, feeling a mix of pride and a strange, prickling anxiety in the back of my neck. I left the ranch at 10 a.m. to escort Clara to the church in town, thinking the worst was over, but as we drove down the long gravel driveway, I saw a white SUV idling by my gate. I should have known then that Beatrice Vane was about to do something she couldn't and oppose. Take back. I'll never forget the sound I heard when we pulled back into the driveway 4 hours later. It wasn't an oppose. The sound of a celebration. It was the low, guttural roar of a heavy-duty excavator and the sickening, rhythmic thud crunch of stone hitting mud. I jumped out of the car, still in my uniform, and ran toward the creek to find my family's legacy being chewed into gravel by a demolition crew while Beatrice stood on the bank, wearing a hard hat like it was a fashion accessory and holding a clipboard with a look of triumphant glee. She'd waited until the exact moment she knew I was occupied with my daughter's vows to send in a crew with a, end quote, non-compliance demolition order, end quote, she'd somehow squeezed out of a corrupt county clerk on a Friday afternoon, end quote. It was for the safety of the children, Silas, end quote. She shouted over the noise of the engine, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern that made my blood run colder than the creek water, end quote. The structural risk was just too high, and the HOA couldn't and oppose to afford the liability of your negligence during such a large gathering, end quote. I stood there, watching 80 years of hand-cut limestone vanish into the muck, the water that had been held back in a peaceful, glassy pond suddenly surging forward in a brown, violent wave that swept away the wedding altar, the chairs, and the memories we were supposed to make that afternoon. But here's the thing about being an engineer. We don an oppose. T just see a pile of rocks. We see the math, the physics, and the consequences of moving things that weren't an oppose. T meant to be moved. As I stood there in the mud, watching the creek reclaim the valley, I noticed something Beatrice hadn't in oppose. T bothered to check because she was too busy being the hero of her own story. You see, Willow Creek doesn't end oppose. T just flow through my land. It's the primary drainage artery for the entire, end quote, Heights, end quote, subdivision, and for 70 years my, end quote, primitive, end quote, dam have been acting as a massive, accidental silt trap and pressure regulator for their entire storm drain system. When she knocked that wall down, she didn't end oppose. T just, end quote, restore the flow, end quote. She unleashed 7 decades of built-up hydraulic pressure and a few thousand tons of saturated silt directly into the culverts of her pristine neighborhood. Within 20 minutes, the sound of the excavator was replaced by the sound of gurgling, and then a series of muffled subterranean pops as the HOA's expensive, designer storm drains began to back up like a clogged toilet in a dive bar. I didn't in oppose. T say a word to her right then. I just took out my phone and started filming the water as it began to pool around the tires of her SUV, then slowly creep up toward the manicured lawns of the houses downstream. Beatrice was still smirking, thinking she'd won, until her phone started buzzing, and then it didn't in oppose. T stop. It was the, end quote, Heights, end quote, residents calling to report that their basements were filling with gray, muddy water and that the community's, end quote, award-winning, end quote, central fountain was currently erupting like a geyser of liquid filth. She turned pale, looking from the rising water to me, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip, end quote. What did you do? End quote. She hissed, and I just pointed at the rushing creek, my voice calm and low, end quote. I didn't in oppose. To do anything, Beatrice. You're the one who moved the rocks. I just hope your homeowner's in oppose. Insurance covers in oppose. Acts of ego, and oppose, because the Army Corps taught me that when you mess with the grade messes back, end quote. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in chaotic karma, as the entire Willow Creek subdivision turned into a stagnant lake of Missouri mud and legal fury. But while the neighbors were busy renting shop vacs and screaming at their insurance adjusters, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of soggy folders that had quite literally floated onto my property during the surge. It turns out that when the HOA's, end quote, storage shed, end quote, near the creek got swamped, it spilled a few secrets that Beatrice had been trying to keep underwater for a long time. As I dried out the pages, I found the real reason she wanted my land integrated into the HOA. It wasn't an oppose, T about aesthetics or mosquitoes. It was about the $1.2 million, end quote, environmental improvement fund, end quote, that had mysteriously dwindled down to almost nothing. Beatrice had been using HOA dues to pay a, end quote, consulting firm, end quote, owned by her brother-in-law to fix, end quote, structural issues, end quote, with the subdivision's drainage, issues that didn't end oppose. T exist until she created one by destroying my dam. She needed my property as a scapegoat, a way to claim that, end quote, upstream negligence, end quote, was the cause of their infrastructure failures so she could trigger a massive insurance payout to cover the money she'd already embezzled. I spent the next week playing a very quiet, very deliberate game of chess, meeting with a few, end quote, old-timers, end quote, in the neighborhood who'd never liked Beatrice's iron fist but were too afraid to speak up. We met in my barn, away from the prying eyes of her security cameras, and I showed them the bank statements and the fake invoices I'd recovered from the mud. One of those neighbors was a retired forensic accountant named Arthur, and when he saw the numbers, his eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. Except his version of Santa Claus involved the FBI and a 20-year prison sentence. We didn't in Oppos to go to the local police because Beatrice had the mayor on speed dial, and we didn't in Oppos to go to the HOA board because they were mostly her handpicked cronies. Instead, we went straight to the state auditor's office and the regional EPA, filing a joint report for, in quote, felonious environmental destruction, in quote, and in quote, interstate wire fraud, in quote. The climax didn't in Oppos to happen in a courtroom, though. It happened at the, in quote, emergency town hall, in quote. Beatrice called to try and pivot the blame for the flood onto me. She stood on the stage of the local community center, looking haggard but still defiant, telling a room full of angry, mud-splattered homeowners that, in quote, Mr. Thorne's illegal dam failure, in quote, was the reason their granite countertops were currently floating in 2 feet of swamp water. She was halfway through a PowerPoint presentation about, in quote, the dangers of unregulated rural infrastructure, in quote, when the back doors of the hall swung open. I walked in, followed by Arthur and 2 men in very plain, very ill-fitting suits who didn't in Oppos. T looked like they were there for the coffee and donuts. I didn't in Oppos. TL, I just walked up to the front, plugged my own thumb drive into the projector, and bypassed her presentation to show the entire room the drone footage of her demolition crew literally pulling the stones apart while she watched with a champagne flute in her hand. Then, I put the invoices on the screen, the one showing $200,000 payments for, in quote, silt removal, in quote, to a company that shared a P.O. box with her brother-in-law's vacation home in Florida. The room went so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioner, and then the shouting started. It wasn't Oppos, just me anymore. It was the people who'd paid their dues for years, the people whose kids' playrooms were currently smelling like sewage, and the people who realized they'd been bankrolling a thief while she tore down their neighbor's history. One of the men in the plain suits stepped forward, flashed a badge that said, in quote, Federal Bureau of Investigation, in quote, and told Beatrice she needed to come with them for a conversation about, in quote, the misappropriation of federally backed disaster relief funds, end quote. Watching her get let out in handcuffs, still trying to fix her hair, while the neighbor she'd bullied for years booed her into the back of a black Tahoe, with a level of satisfaction that no amount of money could ever buy. In the end, it took 18 months to get the ranch back to normal, but, end quote, normal, end quote, looks a little different now. With the settlement money from a lawsuit against the HOA and the personal civil suit I won against Beatrice, who is currently serving a 7-year stint in a federal, in quote, club fed, in quote, for embezzlement. I didn't in Oppos. Just rebuild the dam. I built a state-of-the-art wetland preserve. My new neighbors, the ones who actually care about the land, helped me hand-stack the new limestone blocks, and this time we added a plaque at the top that reads, end quote, in memory of Jeremiah Thorne, water always wins, and time eventually uncovers the truth. End quote. The HOA was dissolved by a court order, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood watch that actually focuses on things like potlucks and tool sharing instead of grass height and clipboard warfare. But sometimes when the sun is setting and the light hits the creek just right, I still think about that look on Beatrice's face when she realized that the very water she tried to weaponize was the thing that finally washed her away. It makes me wonder, how many other people are out there right now, living under the thumb of someone who thinks a title and a neighborhood charter give them the right to erase a family's legacy? People ask me if I hate her, and I honestly tell them no. I'm almost grateful because she reminded this whole town that you can't build a community on lies and expect it to hold back the storm. So if you're listening to this and you've got a, in quote, Beatrice, in quote, in your life, just remember, keep your records clean, keep your head down, and wait for the rain, because sooner or later, everyone has to deal with the runoff. What about you? Have you ever dealt with a, in quote, local dictator, in quote, who thought they were above the law, or did you ever have to stand your ground against someone trying to bulldoze your history? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I've found that the best way to keep these people in check is to make sure they know we're all watching, and we aren't in Oppos. Going anywhere.